Robert Hart always believed in his life that old age would be a time of peace and joy. After more than 30 years of hard work in the same company, he finally had the opportunity to look forward to the future with hope. All these years he worked day in and day out, believing that when the time came, his pension fund would be the foundation of his old age. For Robert, his entire career was built on a belief in stability. He was one of those people who believed in the system. He believed that the years he had worked and invested in the pension fund had brought him a well-deserved result. And now, when he turned 62, he was supposed to retire in peace, relax, travel, and enjoy life without worrying about money. The dream was so simple and so vivid. After all these years of work, now it's just going to be comfortable. Robert thought when it came time to plan his future. He already had several plans in mind for his life after retirement. The first thing he wanted to do was move to a small town on the shore of a lake. He dreamed of a small house with a garden where he could spend hours outdoors, reading books or growing vegetables. No, he had a dream. He believed that old age was not a burden, but a new opportunity. Every year he added new plans. For example, renewing his relationship with his family. He had long wanted to visit relatives with whom he had not communicated due to his busy work schedule. Robert saw himself as someone who would have time to travel, to communicate with friends, to go to nature and just live without worries. He decided not to just take time off from work. Robert was actively preparing for his retirement. He started exploring investment opportunities, how to use his accumulated funds efficiently, and how to be sure of his stability. His pension fund was one of the largest and most reliable in the country, and Robert was confident that he had made the right choice. Everything will be fine, he told himself, because he had worked with the best financial advisors and his pension fund had a reputation for reliability. However, everything started to change overnight. On a typical Monday morning, Robert received a letter. It was a regular envelope from his pension fund. Without hesitation, he opened the envelope, hoping for another statement. But what he saw made his heart flutter. The letter was about an unexpected situation that had arisen with their fund. It turned out that the pension fund was experiencing financial difficulties. At first glance, it seemed to be something temporary. It was explained that the situation was caused by the general economic downturn and certain investment failures. It's a temporary problem. No big deal, Robert thought, trying to reassure himself. He knew that systems usually bounce back from difficulties, but that didn't mean he would be out of money. After all, he was sure things would stabilize in a few months. But the more he read, the more questions he had. Elena's report said that by the end of the year, the pension fund might not be able to pay all the amounts due to its members. The system was in a serious crisis, and it was becoming increasingly obvious. Robert began to feel anxious. How can this be? All these years I've been working, and now they're going to tell me I won't get what I'm due. He asked himself, trying to understand what had happened. At first, he tried to stay calm, trying to convince himself that this was only a temporary difficulty, that it would not affect him directly. However, his hopes began to melt away when the next day he received another piece of sad news at work. The company that managed the pension fund had declared bankruptcy. That's it, Robert thought, and his heart beat faster, and he felt heavy. All those years of hope and confidence suddenly turned into fear and uncertainty. This was the first alarm, but then it was picked up by a wave of other disturbing news. More and more people began to report their problems with pension funds. The heroic hopes he had harbored for decades now turned out to be just dreams that would never come true. And Robert increasingly realized that his retirement could be a disaster, that he, like others, could find himself without a livelihood. Robert sat at the kitchen table, looking at the letters in front of him as if they were his last link to his past. He swallowed hard, and each passing moment seemed to freeze time. And the feeling that everything was going wrong was extremely real. He couldn't believe that even the most reliable system could be shaken. After he received the letter from the pension fund, his thoughts were no longer clear. Robert was not prone to panic, but what was happening was simply impossible. What if he didn't get his money in a few months? How could something he had trusted for decades be destroyed like this? Though over the next few days, Robert continued to gather information about his future. What else could he do? How could he start a new life after retirement if his main savings were about to disappear? Robert decided to see a financial advisor to get some reassurance and more information. The meeting was scheduled for late in the morning. He arrived at the company's office with a feeling of inner emptiness. He sat down at the table in front of the consultant, watching him prepare for the discussion. Robert, your situation is not unique. Many people are facing similar problems right now, the counselor said, trying to encourage him. But that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. Robert looked at the counselor, but he couldn't shake the feeling that even they, the experts, didn't have a clear answer. His pension, his entire future stability, was in jeopardy. What was next? The consultant tried to convince Robert that there was a way to resolve the situation through some investment moves, but each of them seemed to be a temporary measure. Unethical had the money he could not cover all the expenses of old age, especially since he had a large number of medical bills, not to mention the need to maintain his standard of living. He had been working all these years, but now he was not ready for such a change. If you want to maintain financial stability, you have to look for ways to invest. It's difficult, but not impossible. The consultant continued, but for Robert, it sounded like another threat. It seemed to him that even if he followed the advice, he could only delay the inevitable. All his reserves, all those years of saving, all of it was now turning into nothing. Robert decided to talk to his family. He knew they would not be happy with the news, but he needed to share his feelings. His son, Michael, came to visit him on Saturday. Robert tried to keep it all to himself, but in the end he decided he couldn't keep quiet. Dad, everything will be fine. You've worked your whole life, you've earned your pension, and we'll find a way, Michael said, trying to support his father. But even he didn't know what to say. How can you convince someone who feels like their foundation is crumbling under their feet? Each new day brought more sad news. The pension fund was unable to solve the problems, and soon rumors began to circulate that they might default. Fear and uncertainty gripped seniors across the country. Everything they had saved for decades was about to disappear. Robert spent nights without sleep, running through the options in his head of what he could do. What would be left of him? How to maintain at least some financial stability? How to survive old age if you can't even count on a pension? And then one evening Robert received a phone call. It was another letter from the pension fund, and this time everything became clear. After analyzing their accounts and the state of the economy, the pension fund announced a temporary suspension of payments. It was the final verdict. Your pension is currently frozen. We cannot say for sure when payments will resume, said the voice on the other end of the line. Robert sat down, feeling the ground beneath his feet begin to shake. He did not know what would happen next. The new uncertainty and fear became his new companions. Robert realized that now he would have to think about survival. He never thought he would find himself in this situation, and he could not imagine how he would be able to continue living with such a minimum. His plans for retirement, for a quiet life, were shattered, and he did not know what to do next. The unexpected news that shattered all his hopes left him in complete darkness. Robert sat in his chair, rereading all those papers on the table in front of him. They were no longer just letters with banal messages. Now they were symbols of his struggle for the future. Every sheet, every signature was a reminder of how easy it is to lose what you have gained over decades of work. But now he had no choice, he had to act. After his pension was frozen, Robert realized that he could not leave things to chance. His hopes for a quick resolution were dashed, and he began to look for ways to get access to his money. At first, he turned to lawyers to find out there was a legal way to get his money back. But even they could not give a clear answer. Robert, it's complicated, but not hopeless. If you're willing to spend time and money fighting, we can try to find a solution, his lawyer said, looking at the documents. But even the lawyers were not sure if they could do anything meaningful. Robert realized that every day without money was bringing him closer to financial despair, so he had to act immediately. Weeks passed, and each new call brought more disappointment than hope. Robert contacted various organizations, trying to get at least some information, but every time he ran into a wall of bureaucracy. His calls to the pension fund went unanswered, and those who did respond could not give a specific time frame for the resumption of payments. What's this absurdity? I've worked all my life, and now I'm just left with nothing, thought Robert, hanging up the phone in frustration after another fruitless conversation. Despite his despair, Robert did not give up. He started looking for alternative ways. With his resources dwindling every day, he realized that he could not rely on his pension alone. He began to explore investment opportunities for retirees, something that could at least partially replace the income he was counting on. The investments, stocks, real estate. Maybe I can somehow make a go of it, Robert thought, trying to explore new areas. However, all these opportunities seemed so complicated and risky that even after several attempts, he could not come up with a clear strategy. After another conversation with a financial advisor, Robert decided to try another opportunity, collective investment. His friend recommended that he join an investor group where he could find support and profitable opportunities. But when Robert got feedback, it turned out that this path was more like gambling than a stable investment strategy. We have to act fast, not wait for things to fall apart, the consultant said, promising that the group would help him make money in a few months. However, Robert felt that this could be just another deception. I'm not ready to play for such high stakes, he thought. Meanwhile, the pressure from his family only increased. Michael, his son, began to show more and more concern. He would call every day asking if there was any news, if his father had taken another step towards solving the problem. Robert already felt trapped. On the one hand, he had to worry about his financial future, but on the other hand, he couldn't forget his responsibility for his family. Are you out of your mind? Michael once asked, after hearing the news of another failure with the pension fund. You promised me everything would be okay. How can you keep quiet about this? Robert realized that his options were limiting. He had to not only fight for himself, but also try not to disappoint his family. But how to do that when all the paths he tried to take were closing one by one? One evening, while sitting in the kitchen studying financial documents, Robert realized that one way he hadn't tried yet to solve his situation on his own without the help of a third party. He began researching how he could save money by investing it in certain areas, such as loans that allow him to protect his property more securely or other private investments. I may not have all the knowledge about it, but if I don't try, I'll be broke for the rest of my life, he realized as he took the last sip of coffee. This decision became extremely important for him. Now he was not just reacting to the problem, he was taking action. Robert realized that the path to solving his problems would be difficult and long. But he also knew that he could no longer afford to be a passive observer. He started thinking about how to change his life. He no longer wanted to be a victim of circumstances. He was now ready to become a player in his own story. When Robert woke up in the morning, he could not even imagine that this day would change everything. His mind was still preoccupied with thinking about possible strategies to maintain his financial independence. But it never occurred to him that this struggle would bring another bitter surprise of betrayal from, which he would never recover. Robert sat at the kitchen table, checking his email. One by one, he received reports on new investment opportunities, some of which looked very attractive. However, among these messages was one that did not bode well at all. It was news from his old friend John, whom he had started working with many years ago. He worked in the financial sector and always helped Robert with important issues. But there was something in this letter that was alarming. Robert, unfortunately, I have to inform you that your investment in that project we discussed last year did not meet expectations. We lost almost all of our money, John wrote. Robert could not believe his eyes. He knew that investments were always risky, but this situation looked completely unpredictable. He decided to call John to find out what had happened. But the phone call didn't bring any relief. Whoa, I don't even know how it happened, Robert. I tried, I really did. But everything we did was in vain. He heard his friend's small voice on the other end. Robert felt his indignation grow. He was disappointed, but most of all he felt betrayed. Before he could recover from this news, Robert received another blow. After he checked his bank statements, it turned out that there had been a significant write-off in his account. All the money he had worked so hard to save over the years had suddenly disappeared. How could this happen? He shouted alone in his empty apartment. His hands were shaking with frustration. He could not understand how he had fallen into such a trap. He even went to the bank, trying to figure out what had happened, but the answer was not only unpleasant, but simply absurd. The money had been lost through fraud, but because it was one of the investors, the bank had no choice but to simply record the loss. And that was all they could hope for. Robert stood in the center of his living room, looking at the walls, which seemed to be growing cold and impregnable. He could feel his world crumbling. All his hope that he would spend at least the rest of his life in relative comfort had disappeared, just like the money he had invested over the past years. His thoughts turned to chaos. And how could he have trusted people like these investors, these old acquaintances who had used him for their own gain? He couldn't accept the fact that he was surrounded by people who promised to help him, but in reality only set him up. How could he get out of this swamp? Each new step brought more and more suffering. Now that it was clear to him that these people were not who he thought they were, Robert began to question everything he had previously believed to be true. His ex-wife, with whom he had not spoken for several years, began to worry about his health, but her help was only verbal. She called him again and advised him to see a psychologist, but Robert was no longer confident in his abilities. You can't live like this, Robert. You need someone to rely on, she said into the phone. You know I'm always here for you. But this challenge was more than just a matter of money for Robert. He felt betrayed, deceived, and helpless. All these years he had worked to ensure a comfortable retirement, and now, when his life was close to the point where he was supposed to live in harmony with himself, it was all falling apart before his eyes. Despite all the hardships, Robert had no intention of giving up. Having lost trust in his old friends and business partners, he decided to rely on himself. He started looking for other opportunities, lesser-known ones, but ones that offered a chance to recover his losses. Meanwhile, he realized that with each new step he was not just recovering from his losses, he was changing, becoming stronger. And maybe that was the only thing left for him, a chance to start a new life, this time with more lessons and no illusions. A few weeks passed, and Robert still couldn't recover from what had happened to his investment. He tried to gather his strength to move forward, but the more he tried to find new opportunities, the deeper he sank into that dark well of debt from which there seemed to be no way out. He sat at his desk, filling out yet more paperwork, bills, letters from collectors and law firms demanding repayment. Robert couldn't even say exactly how much he owed. The numbers just started to blend together, and the feeling that he was trapped in a financial trap was unbearable. You'll never be able to get out of this cycle, Robert. he thought as he looked at the papers. His thoughts went back to when he signed the loan agreements, thinking it would help him stay afloat. He signed everything in a row, not realizing that each signature on these papers was the beginning of the end. All these debts seemed to have no end. He was no longer able to pay his credit cards, and the small loans he had taken out in the beginning had turned into a mountain of indistinct numbers that refused to decrease. Every day Robert woke up with the feeling that the day would not bring anything good. He tried to keep up with his debts, pay the minimum amounts, just to avoid getting into a worse situation. But his debts only increased, and his situation became more and more difficult. One morning he received a new letter. He knew it was going to be another claim, another financial disaster, but he couldn't avoid what was written on it. He opened the envelope and pulled out a document with the logo of a large company that dealt with lawsuits. "You are in breach of contract, Robert. If you do not pay the debt in the next 10 days, we will be forced to take legal action," the letter read. Robert put it on the table and sat down. His mind was spinning. The shadow of the debt began to become not only a financial but also a psychological burden. Robert felt his life slowly falling apart. His attitude to everything changed. He no longer believed in stability and peace. Instead, he was gripped by constant anxiety, and each new day brought more fear and uncertainty. He began to avoid meeting former friends and family, even if they offered to help. He didn't want to burden anyone with his problems, even though he knew full well the debt was no longer just a personal issue. It was a matter of dignity, and Robert began to feel that he would lose not only his money, but also his self-esteem, his reputation among those who remained of his old circle. One evening, when Robert could no longer muster the strength to do anything, he decided to do something on the verge of despair. He called John again, his old friend with whom he hadn't spoken in a long time, and he didn't know why he was doing this. He was just looking for someone who would listen to him. "Hi, Robert. How are you?" he heard in the phone. John's voice was the same as before, but it felt like something had changed. Robert began to tell him about his problems, how they had started to pile up again, how he had already lost control of the situation. "I know what you are going through, but know that you are not alone. There are options. You can turn to specialists, law firms, to reorganize your debts," John said, and although his words sounded almost emotionless, Robert felt some hope. But this was not a real solution to the problem. It was a temporary reassurance that he could not fully rely on. He started exploring the possibilities of refinancing his debts again. Robert realized that this might be his only chance, but he also realized that this path could lead to an even bigger crisis. However, he had no other choice. The shadow of debt was inevitably present in his life, and Robert knew that the most he could do was not let it tear him apart completely. He began the fight, but he already realized that it would not be easy. It would be a long and exhausting journey. He had never felt so hopeless before, but this fight was his only hope. Robert sat in his chair, his hands trembling as he read the same numbers on the paper again. Debt. Over and over again. He felt more and more like his life was spinning out of control. All his efforts to deal with his financial difficulties were in vain. For every step he took, he faced 10 new obstacles. A few days ago, he thought he would find a way out. There was a chance to raise the money, transfer it to other accounts, or at least gather the strength not to lose everything. But now everything has blurred into one huge black shadow that is simply engulfing him from all sides. There was nothing that could save him. He tried again and again to get rid of this financial abyss, but nothing helped. Repayment of loans turned out to be just a postponement of the inevitable. All these small attempts to deal with financial institutions turned into endless stress. He was offered new refinancing options, but they only made the situation worse. Each new deal raised more questions than answers. Robert even started to think that his previous efforts were just an illusion. And even those financial advisors who promised to help him seemed as powerless as he was. With each passing week, he felt more and more that this was not just a struggle against debt, but a struggle against life itself. The one evening, as he sat down on the couch and checked his bills again, his thoughts were interrupted by a call on his cell phone. His heart was beating faster because he was used to the fact that every call from debt collectors or banks was another attempt to intimidate him. "Robert, we have to take the following measures. Your debt has increased significantly, and if you do not pay by the end of the week, your property may be confiscated," said the voice on the other end of the line. Robert felt his legs give out. This was the last straw. He hung up the phone, staring into the void. Real estate. His house. What had recently been his fortress was now becoming his worst nightmare. Everything he had worked hard for all his life was simply disappearing. And the only thing he could do was to make difficult decisions over and over again, which still did not lead to results. At that moment, Robert had a thought: what if he can't overcome this? What if this is his ultimate destiny? He closed his eyes and thought back to his younger days. He used to have dreams of a peaceful old age without debts and worries. Where did those peaceful moments go? Where is it all? How did I get to this point? He asked himself. He remembered how he and his wife used to throw parties at their home, how they discussed the future of their children, how they planned a life without worries. But that was when money worked for them, not against them. Now, all his attempts to fix the situation only brought new complications. Time passed, and he was sinking deeper into the financial abyss. And although he was well aware that he needed to take radical steps, he could not afford them. All he had were meaningless papers and a list of debts that was constantly expanding. One day, trying to escape from reality, Robert decided to go to the local park. He used to go there often before. It was a place where he could forget about his problems for a moment. He sat down on a bench and looked at the children playing nearby and at the older people sitting and discussing some simple, everyday things. Why does he miss these simple moments so much? Why can't he return to a time when life was clear and carefree? What he would give to just go back to the time when debts had not yet become his shadow. But now he was sitting here, broken alone, with no hope or support. Every day Robert felt his soul shrinking with anxiety. How could he get out of this financial maze without losing himself? He could see that his debts were destroying him more and more, that his strength was diminishing, and that escape was only a temporary defense against reality. Time did not stand still, and all he could do was keep fighting, even if the chances of winning were almost zero. He didn't give up, but it was hard for him to imagine how he could regain what he had lost. The shadow of the debt remained with him, and he did not know how much longer he could bear this burden. Total hopelessness. Robert was sitting in his old office, reading over and over again the promotional letters from various companies. They all promised him one thing: the opportunity to change his financial situation, find new sources of income, and get out of debt. He had no choice, if he wanted to stay afloat at least somehow. He needed to try everything. You have to move forward, even if it seems hopeless. Robert was not ready to give up. He knew that there were opportunities, he just needed to find the right path, and he decided to look for them. With renewed zeal, he began to turn to all possible sources of help: banks, financial advisors, online courses. He even started looking for additional work. One day, while browsing job sites, Robert came across an interesting offer. A huge company was recruiting employees to work remotely. The job looked perfect for him: part-time financial consultant. It was a new opportunity he hadn't even expected. He quickly sent his resume, hoping that at least it would bring some results. But life never gives answers so quickly. He found out that the position was not as easy as it seemed at first glance. The competition was tough, and even an experienced financier had no guarantee of getting the job. However, he did not stop. Each rejection only pushed him to try again. All these failures only strengthened his determination. Along with these attempts, Robert continued to fight with his creditors. His attempts to negotiate a debt restructuring with them were unsuccessful. Each new call from the banks only increased his stress, and he was threatened with a lawsuit, confiscation of property, and even arrest. Each new pressure from creditors only created an even greater sense of hopelessness. But he could not give up. No matter how hard it was, he realized that if he gave up now, it would be the end for him. So, every day the debts were getting bigger, and even the smallest attempts to find a way out seemed like a fight against windmills. Sometimes, when he was alone and just sitting in the darkness of his apartment, Robert would think about his dreams. He remembered the times when everything seemed so easy, when he and his wife planned a weekend vacation, when they and their friends had dinner in a cafe. Those times when he did not think about loans, when everything was clear and calm. Now, in this world of debt and constant stress, he felt lost. Was there even a small possibility of returning to that life? Was it possible to fix everything he had lost, even if it would be at the cost of great effort? One day, when Robert was leaving the store, he met an old acquaintance. It was a man he had not seen for a long time. He was older, but still looked quite healthy and energetic. The man told him that he had successfully started a new business operating on online platforms, and even provides advice to older people on how to optimize their pensions and savings. "Maybe you could try it too," he told Robert. "It won't be a fast track to wealth, but you can find your opportunities one step at a time from the beginning." It was like a sign. Robert heard the great hope in the man's voice, and although he was unsure of his abilities, he decided to give it a try. It was not an easy or quick road, but it was another opportunity. An opportunity he couldn't pass up. Robert turned to several online platforms for training and advice. He even started studying new courses on finance and retirement planning. The feeling that he had some control over his situation again was inspiring. He began to realize that he could build a new strategy for himself, even if it was a long and difficult process. It seems that new opportunities appear only when it seems that there is no more hope. He started to find what he needed: the first clients, the first tips, the first little things that could restore his financial situation. Robert didn't know what the future would bring, but he felt that he wanted to move forward. Not for wealth or quick money, but to get back at least some of what he had lost. To feel that he could control his life again, if only for a moment. It may have been just the first step, but he had already begun to feel that he had a chance again. And that was more than he could have dreamed of just a few months ago. Robert stood outside, looking at the blurry city lights reflected in the puddles on the sidewalks. His hands were shaking. That morning he received the news that changed everything he had achieved. Just a few weeks ago, he felt that his life was moving forward, albeit slowly. He started receiving the first funds from new clients, was studying the market, and developing his business. His future looked more or less clear, and his debts were gradually becoming less painful. But now, this news, it was like a powerful punch in the face that destroyed everything he had fought for. The phone call was short and sharp. His main client, who had promised a steady income, suddenly informed him that due to changes in the market, they could not continue to cooperate. Robert heard indifference in the person's voice. She was not worried. But Robert could not contain his disappointment. It was as if all his progress had disappeared, like a sand castle collapsing with the first wave. "That's all I could do," said a voice from the other end of the line. "Good luck." And that was it. He was left without that cooperation, without a stable source of income. He was once again alone with his hopelessness. And it didn't look like he would be able to find a new opportunity that was as promising. But that was not the only problem. On the same day Robert received this news, he received another one. His creditors started calling again, threatening him that he could no longer postpone the payment. This was not just a sad situation, it was a catastrophic moment when his entire financial reality began to fall apart. He no longer had anything to pay with, and all job opportunities were either frozen or simply disappeared. A feeling of helplessness overwhelmed him. How could he become a hostage to this system that had long since ceased to offer chances? He looked for ways out, tried different options, but each of them left him deeper in debt and a financial hole. In fact, things started going wrong when he was trying to overcome these problems. The stress of losing money and struggling with his financial situation did not go unnoticed. Robert could feel his body starting to fail him. He would often wake up with back pain and headaches, and then spend the day thinking about how to pay for at least the basics. He had no time for treatment. Every day was a struggle, where he had to decide what to save on to get through at least the next day. His health took a back seat as his problems became more and more urgent. But Robert turned to his friends, but their words did not bring him relief. Everyone was either too busy or simply unable to help. His pride did not allow him to ask for money. But what else was left? With each step he took, it became clear to him that he would not get out without help. No matter how hard he tried to hold on, no matter hard he looked for new ways for himself, his body and soul demanded rest. And when he couldn't find a way out, he began to think that maybe that's what he needed, an outside perspective on the situation, help from someone from the outside. One day, when Robert met an old friend by chance, everything changed. They sat down for coffee, and the friend told him about his experience with finances. It turned out that this man had been through a situation very similar to what Robert was going through. But his story was different. He didn't give up, didn't look for quick fixes, and built new opportunities little by little. His business grew not because of the promise of quick wins, but because of real and gradual steps, and this approach was a revelation for Robert. Don't look for a big path. Every day adds up to small steps, he said, and these words seemed to give him new hope. There was no magic recipe, but there was an opportunity to do something better than just sitting around waiting for change. Robert realized that his fate depended on how he took these blows. If he despairs again, he will remain in the same circle of hopelessness. But if he started to do what he could, step by step, even with minimal resources, perhaps this would be the path to a new reality. He could no longer be someone who was just waiting for help. To move forward again, to recover, to move, even if it seems that he has no strength. That's what was important to him at that moment. Robert looked up at the sky, feeling the cold wind that had just arrived. But he knew that it was possible to move forward in these cold winds, even if the path was difficult and unpredictable. He realized that at the moment when everything seems to be lost, there is always a chance for a new beginning. Robert sat in his small cafe, the light from an old street lamp reflecting in his face. He looked at his phone and for several minutes could not decide whether to call. A thought was running through his head, like a terrible virus, destroying all hoping. If I don't take this step, I will lose everything. And at the same time, if I do, I don't know if I'll have the strength to cope with the consequences. That call was his last chance. But it could also have been the final moment. Much depended on how his conversation would be received. All of his previous attempts, dreams, and plans had led him to face a dilemma that would determine his life. Robert could not forget the day it all started. Back then, he still believed that all the difficulties were only temporary, that the future could be changed. But with each passing week, his debts grew and his plans seemed more and more illusory. No matter how you slice it, no one can live with such tension for long, with thoughts about how to face the day tomorrow, whether there will be another hope, or maybe this is the end. So today he decided to act. And here he is in a cafe, making the last, biggest decision of his life. His intuition told him that it was now or never. He knew that this call could lead to a big change, but it was also clear to him that he was on the verge of losing everything, including his dignity. Robert had already put off this moment several times because he was afraid. but he was afraid of what might happen if he made the wrong decision. But there was no other option left. He could not leave himself in such a desperate situation. He knew it was important to move forward, even if the path seemed almost impossible. Robert closed his eyes and thought again about everything that had happened. In all those months of struggle, all those nights when he had stayed awake, coming up with plans to maintain at least the illusion of control. And now he was faced with the final choicing. He could give it all up and try to find another way, but for some reason, the thought of doing so seemed even more terrifying. Leaving everything behind meant not just losing money, but losing his faith in himself. But what if he failed again? What if this path also ends in failure? Perhaps it's better to leave things as they are and just live with what you have. And yet, deep down, Robert felt that if he didn't take this step, if he didn't try to take a chance and get out of this trap, he would never be able to forgive himself for this indecision. So with all his might, he made up his mind, and his finger pressed the button. The call was short but loud, and when he heard the voice on the other end, his heart was heavy. He said everything he wanted to say, hiding neither fear nor determination. This was his only opportunity. He was not going to wait any longer. He was not going to live in fear any longer. Good afternoon, this is Robert. I spoke to you last week. I want to ask for help. Do you think you still have a chance for me? Oh, the voice answered slowly, as if he was having a hard time making this decision. And then, as if in an instant, everything changed. Robert heard the words that made his heart catch his breath. We are ready to help, but there is one condition. It was what he had been waiting for. Instead of a closed door, a new opportunity, a new path was opening up before him. And although he did not yet know what was ahead, he felt that this moment was a chance that was given only once. Now he realized that the choice he made was not only financial, but also moral. It was not just a chance to get help. It was a decision to take responsibility for his life into his own hands. His time was no longer just a time of waiting. It became a time of action. And although the path ahead was not easy, Robert felt that this time he would not be alone. There was no doubt that this was not the end of the struggle. There were new questions, new challenges, new concerns. But now Robert felt that his strength was in his determination. He was ready to take risks, ready to try. I will not give up, he thought as he stood up and left the cafe. Even if this path is difficult, I will not remain in the shadow of fear. Robert stood in front of a large mirror in his new, albeit small, office. At all these months he had been imagining what this moment would look like, when everything seemed to change. But now, standing in an empty room with a few boxes and documents, he felt only deep confusion. Was this the end, or was it just the beginning of a new, unknown part of his life? He realized that everything he had strived for was only a part of something bigger, consequence. The victory he had thought about when he started his was now just a vague goal that had lost its clarity. Among all those attempts to save his retirement savings, all those persuasions, calls to specialists, they didn't seem to lead to what he had hoped for. But at the same time, leaving all this behind, he still had the feeling that the real struggle was just beginning. What to do now? Does he still have a chance to change his fate? Or has he come too far in this dangerous road to retreat? Robert noticed how his perspective on life changed with each new day. He used to see everything through the prism of lost money, dreams, stability. But now he began to realize that perhaps the most valuable thing in all of this was his ability to make decisions. This experience alone gave him a new perspective on life. Now he realized that he was no longer just a victim of the situation, not just a person who had lost everything. Now he had the opportunity to create his own reality. But would he be ready to face new difficulties? Would he have the strength to go this far? He takes a deep breath, a sharp pain in his chest. Each new day now seemed less clear than before. He knew that there was still a lot of struggle ahead, and what was happening now was only a small part of a big story in which he was the main character. Robert remembered how a few months ago there was nothing. Only emptiness and fear. Now he realized that the struggle, although far from over, was giving him new hope. He had managed to find his place, albeit on new, difficult terms. What awaits him ahead? What will this new path look like? Will it be successful, or will everything fall apart again? Robert didn't know, but he no longer felt as panicked as he used to. This is a new stage in his life, a stage where all answers are only temporary. Perhaps he will always be looking for new opportunities, because life never gives all the answers. He still had to go through many steps to survive new blows of fate. But he knew one thing for sure: he would no longer just stand in the shadow of his past. Robert wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at his hands. He needed to put everything together again. All these months of uncertainty had left their marks on his body and soul. But now he had to move forward. There was no time for doubts. Only forward. He picked up his phone and looked at the screen again. The message from his financial advisor that had been waiting for a response for so long. A written confirmation that promised at least a little light at the end of the tunnel. But what was next? Would it really change his life? And the answer remained unknown. And this was another impetus to really understand, even in a moment of hope, there are no final decisions. What if, in the end, all of this is just another stage in the great struggle? At that moment, he felt that the steps he would take today would be just a part of a bigger story that was ongoing. And perhaps the most interesting part was yet to come. Robert did not know whether he would be rich or poor at the end of this story. But he knew one thing for sure: life would not end with those two words. It will continue, and he will have to decide how to go on. If he was lucky, he would find a way. If not, he will continue to struggle. It was an ending without answers, without guarantees, without right decisions. And it was his life. And now that you've finished this episode, ask yourself, are there moments in your life when you're also at a crossroads? How will you make your choice when you face this question again? Life has no guarantees, but there are always opportunities. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories.